back, everybody. It's now time to get serious. It's time to talk about methods of research. No, look, we have to talk about methods of research. We have to get an understanding of how sociologists know what they know. I mean, sociologists don't just sit around thinking about society and writing whatever pops into our heads. There's a process that differentiates sociology as a science and just ordinary run-of-the-mill social commentary that anyone with a blog can do. Not that having a blog is a bad thing. Understanding methods of research is of especial importance in this day of alternative facts and fake news. How do you know the fake news from the real news, the alternative facts from the, factual facts? There is a difference, and understanding how sociologists do their work can help you in sifting through the tsunami of information that marks our age. So methods of research is going to be the focus of the next two lectures. First, we're going to talk about traditions of sociological exploration, and then we're going to learn about quantitative methods of research. Next lecture, we'll learn about qualitative methods of research and address some of the ethical concerns of doing sociological research. So, let's get started. In order for sociologists to draw conclusions, their observations must be grounded and supported in two ways, with data and with theory. First, let's talk about data. Data is factual information that the sociologist can subject to analysis. By factual, the scientist means that the data can be confirmed. The sociologist can gather this data in two ways. First, she can go out and get the data herself. This is called primary data, or data that's collected personally by the researcher. Doing this is beneficial because the researcher has control of the data collecting process. She can use methods of research that are specific to her population and research setting and needs. On the other hand, collecting primary data is time-consuming and possibly expensive. The researcher may also have difficulty gaining access to her research subjects. Let's say, for instance, she wants to do research on, say, drug dealers. She may not be able to get direct access to people who are willing to admit to dealing drugs. Another option is for the researcher to use secondary data. This is data that has already been collected by other researchers, research agencies, or government agencies that collect official statistics. Case studies or documentaries are also examples of secondary data. Many universities and academic departments and research institutes keep valuable data sets that are available to researchers. This is a huge time saver and even a money saver. On the other hand, data collected by one group of researchers may not quite fit the needs of another researcher in a different research setting. Also, by using data that others have collected, you're bound by the limitations of their research. Theory is the next element of sociological research that really needs to be elaborated. In my mind, the word theory is one of the most misused words, at least in American culture. Many Americans use the word theory as a synonym for a guess, concept, or personal opinion. Some believe that there's some kind of hierarchy involved in knowing stuff. First, you start off with a guess, then form a hypothesis. When the hypothesis is confirmed, it becomes a theory. When the theory is confirmed, it becomes a fact. These folks have the process very confused. Theories don't ever become facts. Hypotheses do not become theories. Theories, hypotheses, and facts are all different tools in the research process that really need to be understood. Consequently, in the United States especially, we get people who argue that evolution or global warming are just theories. Since they're only theories, they don't have to be taken seriously until they become facts. Until then, they're really no more relevant than any other opinion. But this isn't how the process works. Evolution is a theory that has been tested and retested for 150 years. Global warming is a theory that really does describe the climate phenomena that the world is experiencing. These theories need to be taken seriously because they carry with them real consequences for real life. They should not be rejected simply because people don't understand what a theory is. For something to be a theory, it must satisfy two criteria. First, a theory must explain a given phenomenon. In other words, it must be valid. Secondly, one must be able to use a theory to make predictions about hypothetical outcomes. A researcher should be able to formulate hypotheses based on the theory that can be confirmed through testing and retesting. In other words, the theory is reliable. Now, we'll talk about validity and reliability in a little bit. The bottom line is that if these criteria are not met, then you don't have a theory. For instance, many Americans talk about the intelligent design theory, the idea that the universe is so complex that it must have been designed by some supernatural entity, much like you can't get an airplane just by amassing random parts and shaking them up. Intelligent design isn't a theory. One might argue that intelligent design does explain the existence of diverse species, But the explanation breaks down when we consider the concept of complexity. Why, for instance, would an intelligent designer include vestigial organs or body parts such as leg bones in whales? Also, we cannot use intelligent design to formulate hypotheses, at least not without knowing the whims of the intelligent designer. It's not a theory. You may believe it to be true, but that's irrelevant. It's not, by definition, a theory. Now, the fact that the previous 6 lectures were dedicated to introducing a bunch of theories should demonstrate the importance of theory in sociological research. Sociological research is, in essence, a process of creating theories to describe the social world and then testing those theories against reality. Through this ongoing process, sociologists can test their observations to determine their validity and reliability. Validity means that our conclusions match what's going on in the real world. For instance, according to Pew Research Center, about 70% of Americans feel that crime rates have increased in the last 10 years. This is the common sense notion when watching the news. However, real crime statistics show that crime is at historic lows, and though there are some specific regions experiencing an increase in violent crime, this pattern is not a reflection of the society overall. This misperception of crime may have real consequences, as almost 80% of Trump voters believed crime was getting worse, while this was only true of almost 40% of Clinton supporters. If more people had a valid understanding of crime, might that have influenced the results of a presidential election? Reliability means that you consistently get the same results. So, for instance, when we're researching crime, we might use the Unified Crime Report put out by the Department of Justice. The UCR gives you the total number of crimes reported for each category, known as index crimes. When you look at the trends on the Unified Crime Report over time, you should get a relatively smooth trend. If you get a trend that is all over the place, you're probably not using a reliable measure. But there's more to it than that. To understand if a measure is valid or reliable, you have to know exactly what is measured. The researcher has to operationalize his terms. For instance, the UCR measures the number of crimes reported to authorities. Crimes are divided into what are called index crimes. Violent crimes specifically refer to murder and non-negligent manslaughter. Forcible rape, robbery, and aggravated assault. Property crimes specifically refer to burglary, larceny, and motor vehicle theft. What about other crimes like drug possession, prostitution, wage theft, loan sharking? Well, those aren't considered index crimes, so they're not part of the measure. Also, the UCR only counts crimes that are reported. What about crimes that are not reported? For instance, if someone steals your car, you're probably going to report it. But if someone steals your bike, maybe not. If you get into a fist fight with a stranger, you might report the assault. If you get into a fist fight with your brother-in-law at your sister's wedding, you might not. So the UCR is useful, but it's not comprehensive. So to draw a reliable conclusion about crime, we might have to use another measure. Another measure for crime is the National Crime Victimization Survey. The NCVS is a survey of about 75,000 people about their history of being victimized in the last year. Based on this measure, we can get an estimate of how many people were victimized. When we take the NCVS and compare it to the UCR, we should get consistent results. What do we get? Well, some results are more consistent than others. Property crimes and sexual assaults are examples of measures that are higher for the Crime Victimization Survey than they are for the UCR, meaning that many such crimes are not reported. Robberies and serious domestic violence tends to get reported to the police. General theft, on the other hand, is unreported at much higher levels. Both the UCR and the NCVS, however, show that overall there has been a decrease in crime since the mid-90s. This decrease in crime is a reliable stat because it can be determined using different measures, the UCR and the NCVS. There are two major approaches to conducting sociological research, positivism and interpretivism. The positivist approach was pioneered by the philosopher Auguste Comte. You remember Comte from Lecture 3. Comte believed that the same scientific methods used to understand the natural world should be applied to understanding society. The positivist approach mostly emphasizes what is called the deductive method. In other words, the researcher will use a theory to formulate a hypothesis and then test that hypothesis. The positivist is most likely to use what are called quantitative methods of research. Quantitative methods are those methods using numbers and measurable values. There are three main quantitative methods: surveys, experiments, and content analysis. Under surveys, I include questionnaires and structured or closed-ended interviews in the same category. Each of these techniques involves asking individuals a pre-established series of questions with limited choices that are given number values. These methods are relatively easy to put together and analyze. Using the same questions with the same responses improves the reliability of the data. As with any form of statistical data, the more people you have responses from, the more valid the data. Many surveys allow the researcher the ability to question thousands of people within a relatively short amount of time. Longitudinal surveys can also be done to gather data on a particular population over a long period of time. Cross-sectional surveys are those that compare variables among two or more groups. For instance, we might want to analyze educational attainment by race. Quantitative methods make it relatively easy to do this. There are some limits to these questioning methods, however. It might be difficult to get people to participate, especially when the topic is sensitive, personal, or even painful. When people do participate, however, it's impossible to know if they're telling the truth or giving an accurate account. This may not even have to do with respondents actually lying. Sometimes our responses to questions are influenced by how we happen to be feeling at any given time. If someone is conducting a structural interview on marriage and the respondent had just had a big argument with his spouse, he may be inclined to give answers that he otherwise would not have given. This limitation can be controlled by repeating the research or comparing the results. Even if people are lying or giving inaccurate responses, if they're doing so at a consistent rate, then the research is still useful. Another limitation is by pre-establishing the questions and responses, the questions themselves are subject to the researcher's assumptions and may be biased. Have you ever completed a survey in which none of the responses match your particular preferences? Another problem is what's called the researcher effect or the interviewer effect. This happens during face-to-face questionnaires and structured interviews when the relationship between the researcher and the respondent shapes or biases the responses. I may find myself giving different responses to questions from people I like or trust than I would to people I don't like or trust. Just a simple thing like a smile from the researcher during the questioning can shape the respondent's answers. We often try to please the people we interact with. On the other hand, if the researcher doesn't smile, we may feel like we're giving the wrong answer. Experimentation is another quantitative method. Experiments are difficult to do in sociology. Often sociologists will use experiments done by social psychologists and such. Regardless, sociology experiments are set up much like any other experiment. The idea behind experiments is to test the relationship between different variables. Variables are those factors believed to be related that the researcher is testing. The variable that the experimenter targets or manipulates is called the independent variable. It does not change and is not expected to change. The variables that the researcher is measuring are called dependent variables. A basic experiment is set up by dividing subjects into at least two groups. First is the control group, or the group that the researcher does not manipulate. After the control group, the experiment must have at least one experimental group. This is the group that is predicted to be influenced by the experiment. The idea is, if the independent variables of the control and experiment groups are the same going into the experiment, then any change seen in the experiment group but not seen in the control group at the end of the experiment must be caused by the experiment itself and is the dependent variable. In other words, the change depends on the context of the experiment. Dependent control? What the? Look, it's not rocket science. Well, no. Actually, it kind of is rocket science. But anyway, a famous example of a classic social science experiment was the Bobo doll experiment, conducted in 1963. In this experiment, children were divided into four groups, 3 experimental groups and a control group. The children in the 3 experiment groups were shown films depicting different types of violence. The children in the films were the independent variables. The control group was not shown the videos. The children were then allowed to play with inflatable Bobo dolls. The children who had seen the violent films exhibited violent behavior toward poor Bobo. The children's behavior is the dependent variable. The children in the control did not show the same behavior. This indicated that at the very least, there was a correlation between violent videos and violent behavior. It's tough to do sociology in a lab, however. When sociologists do experiments, they usually are field or natural experiments. These are experiments that take place in the real world. Consequently, it's difficult to set up controls, so at best, natural experiments can offer correlations. Harold Garfinkel's experiments were some of the most inventive. In one experiment, some of Garfinkel's students were sent home with instructions to behave as if their parents were strangers. In this case, the students' interactions were the independent variables, and the parents' responses were the dependent. Experiments are great ways to find correlations and even to test causality. The parameters of experiments make them easy to reproduce to test for reliability. Experiments are often limited by virtue of the fact that they are conducted under very specific conditions, so the results may not be generalizable to the population as a whole. The children of the Bobo experiment, for instance, were given an inflatable doll that was really ideal for punching. Frankly, I don't know how anyone could resist punching a Bobo doll. Would they have still exhibited violent behavior if they were given trucks to play with? Another problem is called the Hawthorne Effect. This is named after a famous experiment in 1933 in which Elton Mayo went into the Hawthorne works to test different variables and how they impact productivity. He set up a natural experiment in which he changed certain variables such as lighting in an experiment group to see which variables improve productivity. What they found, however, is that everything he did improved productivity. Increased lighting, decreased lighting, it didn't matter. In this case, the relevant independent variable wasn't anything he was using in his experiment. He was the independent variable. The workers were responding to being observed by the researcher. So the Hawthorne effect happens when the knowledge of being observed results in a change of behavior. The final type of quantitative analysis is content analysis. This is done on text and other media. In this case, the researcher is looking for recurring themes in the media that he or she is looking at. Looking at media content is useful not because media is a reflection of the real world, we all know that's not the case, but because media does reflect cultural ideals. For instance, a master's thesis done by Brittany M. Trimble Clark at Minnesota State University examined representations of young women in 17 magazine in 2011. She concluded that most of the articles contained anti-feminist content and focused largely on appearance. What does this suggest about our cultural ideals with regard to young women? Looking at and conducting quantitative research requires an understanding of statistics. No, wait, don't worry. We're not going to cover statistics in this lecture. We'll do that down the line. But there are quite a few resources that can help you get a basic understanding of statistics and get you started on using quantitative research to understand the real world. I'll have those linked below. Quantitative methods in general are a great way to get a big picture understanding of social phenomena. Using statistical tools makes the research relatively easy to validate and test for reliability. If the study is large enough and uses representative samples, then it is likely that the conclusions are generalizable. In other words, the conclusions that can be drawn from a study group is probably true for the population as a whole. If you have a sample of 10 people and discover that 5 of them are fans of Game of Thrones, you're probably stretching it to conclude that 50% of the people in the country are Game of Thrones fans. That may be just a random situation. But if you get 1,000 people and discover that 500 of them are fans of Game of Thrones, it's more likely these results are generalizable. Better still if you get 10,000 people. Quantitative research is so powerful and so useful that it's almost impossible for you to get through the day without becoming a data point on some quantitative database. You may be asked to participate in a survey or a study, but even if you're not, data is being collected on you pretty much all day, every day. Your school keeps quantitative data on you. Your workplace quantifies your productivity. The search engines you use online, your bank and credit agencies keep track of your spending habits. Your cell phone keeps track of where you go, who you call, and what apps you use. We're entering a period characterized by what has been called big data, in which just about every aspect of your life can be broken down into quantifiable bits of information and used by governments or business interests or schools or any institution or organization that you participate in. It's a form of intensive and possibly invasive surveillance. That's creepy. But regardless of how powerful and important quantitative research is, there's one big limitation as it relates to sociology. If the sociologist is interested in the lived experience of individuals, then quantitative data and research is lacking. Sure, I could create a quantitative profile of racism in my community that would be valid and reliable, but would it tell me about racism as it's experienced by real people? How do people of color navigate and deal with racist social structures, for instance? What are some processes by which people become racist or even reject racism? These are important questions that deserve attention by sociologists, but are not easy to analyze. Quantitative methods are inadequate toward this task. To research such subjective matters, sociologists have to use some innovative strategies from an interpretivist tradition. These strategies usually fall under what we call qualitative research, and that's the topic of the next lecture. In the meantime, go have fun with stats.